our first diasporic dialogues at the Department of Afro-American and African Studies here at University of Michigan. My name is Professor Scott Polson Bryant. I'm an assistant professor here in the department in my second year, and I'm really excited to be part of this program. And I'm really, really excited to have Dr. André Brock in the room with us to chop it up for an hour or so with questions from you guys afterwards. Dr. André Brock is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. He writes on Western technoculture, Black technoculture, and digital media. His scholarship examines Black and white representations in social media, video games, web blogs, and other digital media. He has also published very influential research on digital research methods. And his award-winning book, his complicated, great book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by networked digital technologies, and came out last year, 2020, from NYU Press, right? NYU University Press. Thank you for joining us today, André. Dr. Brock.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm André to you.
André, well, no doubt. Thank you, André. Or Doc Dre on Twitter, where we hang out a little bit. So there's lots for us to talk about. I want to talk about your book a little bit. I want to talk about your thinking around cybercultures, technoculture. But the first question I need to ask you, sort of two-pronged, right? So. How did you come to this work, this amazing work you do, thinking about these topics together, in conversation together, but also want to hear a little bit about your own sort of personal relationship to cyberculture, to social media, to these spaces where we're all having this activity these days?
That's all the same question, fam.
Okay, so you can it out.
The intellectual side of it is when I was in my first PhD program, which was rhetoric and composition. I was at Carnegie Mellon, and I wanted to talk about Blackness and technology then, because Carnegie Mellon was at the forefront of research on the internet and social, right? And there was nothing. There really was nothing at the time. This is 2001, right? Right after 9/11. And so all they really thought I should be able to talk about was the digital divide. And I was like, but I just left New York, and folk there are rocking two-way pagers, they're texting, they have their own laptops, like we're writing in coffee shops. Like, obviously there's more to what we do than the digital divide. And so then I transferred to Illinois, which is where I ended up getting my degree in information science. And I started trying to explore what it meant to do Blackness online, to be Black online, especially considering at the time, most folk were still convinced that you actually couldn't find Black people online. They were just white people playing at being Black. Because, Black people can't afford technology. They don't have the skills, right? And this is even as, Black Planet is taken on. So that's the intellectual side. From those humble beginnings, I've been looking at portal websites such as Yahoo, newspaper websites such as the New York Times and weblogs, also browsers, video games, and then social media, mostly Twitter. And it's been fascinating because with each type of computer-mediated communication, with each technology, the ways in which Blackness articulated changes around the circumstances, but it never changes in its core mission. Right. The only big difference I would say is that social media has brought a larger number of everyday Black folk online than anything else had in history. And as such, the ways that we understand Blackness online have changed for good and for worse. The personal side is I've been a nerd all my life. I used to carry paperback books in my pocket when I was riding the train in New York. It's funny too, because I was talking to my students about how people become post-human. And for them, they locate the post-human in computer technologies. But what is more post-human than a young Black man diddy-bopping around New York in the 80s and 90s with a Walkman, right? All of a sudden, you have a soundtrack, right? A soundtrack that you chose that is being broadcast back to you through earphones from an analog cassette tape, or what I was using a mini disc at the time, right? But it puts you in your own world where your Blackness could be interrupted. But it was your soundtrack, your music, your life, right? And so thinking about my engagement with technology, like I've had computers since I was a baby, maybe since I was 13 or 14. And my love of technology, fortunately, I've been able to transform that into a job where I get to write about social media and video games, because Blackness is the gift that keeps on giving, right? We're always doing something interesting or spectacular, or just mundane that's actually pretty cool. And that's what I love to write about.
Right. No, no doubt. I completely understand you about that, sort of the soundtrack that kind of technology provided for those of us pre-digital, pre-online life. And I'm someone who comes from the hip hop world, right? So there was always that way in which the music itself has a kind of analog history, right? That then developed through all these sort of accesses and changes in digital, right, capabilities, right? So even that sonic soundtrack started to change over time, right? How we, like you said, you had a mini disc. There was a Walkman first, right? Then the mini disc, then the mini CD player, then the mini, right? I love those changes are great. So one of the things that I loved about your book, and it's probably appropriate to start here, considering the metaphor of it, is how you named the Negro Motorist Green Book as one of the first cultural network browsers. And you sort of use that to start this route that you take to think about this history. Can you say a little bit about why you chose, how you sort of landed on thinking about this through that sort of old ancient text, if you will, to think about this sort of modern phenomenon that you study?
Absolutely. But I can also tell, if you haven't been following my Twitter account, because I got into an argument about this last week.
Okay, I missed that. I told you I've been on deadline. I probably missed that.
You've been on deadline. So part of the argument was because this young lady has cited my research to do a quantitative study about Twitter. And she also used the same argument that the Negro Voters Green Book could be understood as a model for Black Twitter. And what she's pulling upon is my argument that the Green Book, as opposed to just being a phone book or a catalog, actually describes a network, a distributed network of Black cultural and leisure and vivification sites where you can bring yourself or your car back to life. You get gas, you get food, might get to sleep, right? And so as a network browser, it gives you the resources, kind of like, you're old enough to remember this, most of your audience may not, the Yahoo Open Directory. Right. So when Yahoo, when the web first really started getting popular, Yahoo had a team of people, not algorithms, who would find interesting or important destinations for you to go to, and they would publish it as an open directory. It's the same concept, because there are so many things out there that without curation are not discoverable. And the Green Book did a lot to identify those resources, codify those resources, but also make plain that you can find Blackness all over this country in a technological context. Right. And so the metaphors we use about traveling the internet are the same that we use about traveling the highway. Right.
Right. The information superhighway, if you will.
The information superhighway. Exactly.
Right.
And so to me, it's a directory of Black life. Right. The argument I got into was that this young lady was insistent in saying, and I will not call her out, but she was insistent in saying that we should only see the Green Book as a travel document, not as anything more than that. And that what we should be focusing on is how it allows Black people to survive. And my argument for the Green Book, and to push back against this young lady, is that a network of Black life is more than just survival, because in addition to showing places where we had food, right, they also showed vacation destinations like the Black beaches in Atlantic City or in Ocean Park, Maryland, right? Even later on in the 60s, it had destinations in the Caribbean and stuff. And so people were pushing back and saying, oh, well, that's just letting you know that these places aren't racist. Like, no, that's letting you know that these places are for Black people, right? Which is it's a different perspective, it's a different way of looking things, right? And so I stick to my guns. I still say it's a directory for Black life, but I can understand why the young lady would try to narrow it down and say it's a poor analogy for Black Twitter, because as she said, Black Twitter is much more than just how to get to where you want to go, right? I'm like, you're right. Black Twitter is also hair resources. Did you drink water today? Look how bad this woman's weave is installed, right? Why don't these kids pull their pants up? I wish you 30-plus-year-olds would get off Twitter. It's much more than just the destinations that the Green Book described, but in the same way, it's a directory of Black life, right? Of how to manage the everyday on your way to being the best person you can be, or the most ratchet person you can be, which is sometimes the same thing.
I was going to say, those are literally about to say, those can be the same thing, can't they?
Absolutely.
Particularly in a sort of mode of communication that is based so so much on words, on language, right? That the sort of parallel you're talking about, whether it's intersection or parallel, can really sort of come into focus through language, through what Greg Tate calls slanguage, if you will,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you bring up Black Twitter, and another interesting aspect of your book is the way you sort of pose this question through your thinking about work Amiri Baraka did in the 60s. And you sort of you talk about the way Baraka is thinking about Blackness and thinking about culture and thinking about information technology, this notion of informational Blackness, right? And you ask the question, like, what would that look like now, right? What is there digital practice that would represent those intersections that Baraka was talking about? And you said, yes, it's in the sort of racial digital practices of Black Twitter. So as one of the great thinkers, if you will, about Twitter and about Blackness, talk about Black Twitter for us. Like, what is Black Twitter? How do you sort of frame it? How do you see it getting framed in the world, in the work, in the discourse? Talk about Black Twitter.
So that word frame is really important to me. So one of the things I try to do in the book is I argue that technology should be understood as what the thing is, what can be done with the thing, or how things are organized, but also how we understand ourselves. And that last part is really crucial for me, because many times when we're talking about technology, we resort to the first two. We resort to talking about what it is or what you can do with it. And we often leave unexamined the beliefs that we bring into it. So Twitter is an interesting test case because Twitter doesn't fit the paradigm of most computer-mediated communication. It's not productive like email. It won't get you a job like Monster.com or LinkedIn, right? It's not even family-oriented or particularly interest-oriented, like say, Facebook is family/friend-oriented, Pinterest is interest-oriented. Twitter is kind of both and all of those things. And because it focuses on short-form communication, that means the communications which grab people's attention, which bring people's visceral responses to the fore, are the ones that get the most engagement, right? And so it started off with this really banal statement. It started off by Jack and them asking, what are you doing today? Or what's up in your world, right? And from that, it's expanded to people not only saying, hey, my job was really trash today. Can y'all please send me pictures of puppies, right? But it's also expanded to other things like activist organizations using it as a way to build up energies for the protests that they wish to have, right? Or even communities of women coming together to support themselves amongst all the misogyny and objectification that they get both online and off, right? And so it's kind of an everything place. But for me, the interesting part is the Blackness of it all, right? So I often get queries as to why I say Black Twitter and not Black queer Twitter, not Black feminist Twitter, not Black trans Twitter, right? And I say that, all those things are of importance. But to me, the important part is that you're beginning all those descriptive phrases with the word Black. Right, as Halle Berry said, I'm many things, but I'm a Black woman first, right? And that Blackness is the thing that I'm really interested in interrogating, in part because one of the frames that we have for Blackness is I'm not like those other Negroes. One, right? Because Du Bois said Black people are understood in the U.S. as a low-class, undifferentiated mass. Those are his words, right? And many of us bougie Blacks are like, I'm different from that. That ain't me, right? For the Detroit folk, I didn't go to Cass or Renaissance, right? And so everybody has their markers of difference for Blackness, right? So we're heterogeneous, right? But we're also super inventive. We're also really expressive. And I wanted to highlight those qualities when I talk about Black Twitter as a whole, because one of the things that I find fascinating about Twitter is that the mechanisms that it has, so the short form communication, it's now 280 characters, right? Plus the ways you build networks of followers and followees, plus the fact that it's really this affective language that gathers attention, maps super well onto Black signifying discourse.
Right.
So think about your mama jokes, right? Your mama jokes are not long drawn out blog posts.
Right.
They're not things that you necessarily say to your friends, although your friends will engage in your mama jokes from time to time, right? They are things that are said for an audience as performance to demonstrate your wit, your timeliness, your skill at changing the ways people understand different words. Like your mama's so fat they use her as a taxi cab, which is the worst your mama joke ever, but you understand what I'm saying.
Right.
And And Twitter is built so that an audience can respond in kind to those particular tweets. Right. And so to me, that's the beauty of it. It has become, Black Twitter has become this signifying space in a way that blogs could not be, in a way that MySpace and Black Planet could not be. They could include signifying things. They could have entire essays on signifying, but there wasn't a lot of signifying going on there. The closest analog is spaces like OK Player. Right. And so a lot of people say OK Player is the beginning of Black Twitter because it was a bulletin board featuring fanatic music lovers who loved the Soulquarians and everybody else. And they would not only argue about how much better this music was and the crap that was out at the time, but also have additional ancillary topics about being Black in Brooklyn, being Black in the West Coast. Right.
You're taking me back now.
I know. So OK Player is part of it, but I argue that much of Black Twitter actually came from a more widely used form of Black entertainment at the time, and that's the gossip and entertainment blogs. So Concrete Loop, Crunktastical, Nicole Bitchy, YBF, where they had these really robust comment sections, and young single Black, why can't I remember the name, Damon and Panama. It'll come to me.
Oh, very Smart Brothers over
Very Smart Brothers.
Right.
Yes. Right. And so these places built out commenting communities and short form comments that were used to signifying on each other. One of the things I loved about Very Smart Brothers is for a while when they were still young, the first few years, every time somebody jumped in the comments and said, hey, it's my first time here, Damon or Panama would jump in and say, welcome and shit.
Right.
That's not a civil greeting, but it's a Black ass greeting, right? And so, and so the ways of maintaining and constructing Black identity in these spaces in a short form format, I think is just as significant a factor on what Black Twitter is. So that's a long explanation. There's another sort of explanation in that Black Twitter is made up of collective. So I resist calling it a community. There's Young Black Twitter, there's Hotep Twitter, there's UOK Cis Twitter, There's politically engaged Twitter, there's Afro-pessimist Twitter, there's Passport Twitter. There are all these collectives, but they're all Black folk, right? They express different interests, they converge and diverge around certain topics, but the Blackness is their common core. And Twitter also affords that capacity, right? It's not a Facebook group, right? It's not a thread on a bulletin board. It's shifting. I think the word, I want to say amorphous, but that's not the right word. We'll come back to that. So yeah, it's this complex space. I call it a satellite public, a satellite counterpublic, because sometimes it engages with stuff that really affects the world, like George Floyd. And sometimes it's off in its own world, like Thanksgiving for Black Planets, or, well, Frida's here, so I'm not gonna say it. The N-word Navy, spaces that are about us, for us, right? And it does that with equal adeptness, right? We bring our level of cultural critique and wit to everything we do.
Right. It's hearing you said this notion of the space as a as a sort of core of collectives rather than community is actually really fascinating to me. I never sort of framed it that way in my mind, and I think that makes sense because one of the things it brings to mind is the way in which you can accidentally, in a sense, through seeing something someone liked or commented on, you can get introduced into this new collective, right? And there's a way in which that sort of Blackness that you talk about, Blackness almost as a kind of digital identity, right? That sort of exists in that space, that you can pick up the language, you can pick up the vibe, you can pick up, right? And then find yourself part of this collective that it can be very different in subject matter from another collective you're in, but at the same time provide this nurturing or comfort or joy or even just the sort of shared humor of signifying, right? Because that happens in so many of those collectives. I think that's fascinating to think about.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Is that this you sort of think about, you use this phrase of Black technocultural practice, which I think is an interesting way of sort of getting into what you call, I want to actually quote something from the book. You talk about networked online identity. I want to read you a bit of yourself right back to you real quick.
Oh no.
You say you're writing so lovely. Don't say that. Networked online identity makes internal Black communal discussions visible to an audience that is primed to receive and respond to those struggles while also making them visible to an audience of out-group members who might not be directly addressed, but are always present as signifiers. And this, and sort of what you were talking about sort of got me thinking about that quote, that from the introduction to your book. And also one making me want to hear from you, if we sort of branch out, not just branch out from Blackness to sort of thinking about the sort of interracial, cross-racial responses that happen in these spaces, right? Because they can be really vital in ways, they can be violent in ways, but I want to hear your thoughts about that, which I think might also mean we have to bring up this idea of digital blackface. That might be something we have to talk about, and I know you have thoughts about that. I would love for you to share. But yeah, that's that networked identity thing is, I think, some more we'd love to hear about.
So what became clear with Twitter that was only hinted at in previous social media or new media platforms, like blogs specifically, was that white people paid attention to what we said, right? Even if it's the infamous Slate article that Farhad Manjoo wrote, which occasioned a series of Black explainers, which look at what these Black people are doing today. Isn't that fantastic, right? That Black people hate, right? But also that, you know, in many cases, people, well, let me take a step back. So Andrew Sullivan, who I hate to quote, once said something that really stuck with me, is that white Americans don't know how Black they are. Right. And Baldwin says something similar in the If Black English Isn't a Language, right? That if you took Blackness out of white America, if white folk had never had Black people to influence them, it would sound completely different.
They would sound like
so many different
completely different species of human, basically. Yeah. Is that where he talks about jazz, for instance? Like,
yes.
Right. I love that.
Right. And so thinking about, before we get to appropriation, how imbricated Blackness is with whiteness here in the United States, where they couldn't, from across the ocean, say, sorry, we're letting you free, right? So long, Barbados, so long, Nigeria, right? They couldn't do that, right? We're still here. And they're still finding ways to try to keep us in our place. But at the same time, they also have a love-hate relationship with us, where we symbolize their dark desires and their darkest fears, right? And so that desire and fear, I think, kind of mesh into this water, I guess, for lack of a better word. So like the great David Foster, I can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote this really fascinating thing. Does a fish know it's in water? Right? And no, because to the fish, that's just the world. White people don't know how Black the world they live in consciously, but like Charles Mills says, they have an epistemology of ignorance that encourages them to forget, to disremember how Black the world is that they've constructed, right? And so we see elements of their attraction from time to time, right? We see it in the commodification of our dances and trying to uptake our hairstyles, our clothing styles, our language itself, our slang, right? And so that visibility was made most apparent by Twitter because of the hashtag and the trending topic, right? Because suddenly there was a network who had a mechanism to amplify the things that we were congregating about and talking about, and then brought it to the attention of journalists, right? And other tech folk, right? To see that we are actually doing these really valuable, interesting conversations that really made this network vivacious. And it's not just Twitter. This happened on Clubhouse too, right? Where Clubhouse had to open it up because the geeks just weren't making it happen. They brought Black people in, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe we shouldn't have let all these Black people in, but you know.
right. That takes you in a whole other sort of space that then needs to be sort of pared back in those spaces. Right.
The sentence that you read, though, is me making a computational evolution to Du Bois' statement of double consciousness, right? So that we're constantly in a world where we're striving to understand ourselves, but at the same time being perceived through the mindset of others. That's what network distributed Blackness is, right? Because these spaces weren't created for us by us. And we can talk about how that could be a problem in and of itself. right?
Right.
But at the same time, just like the corner was not constructed for us, we didn't bring the rock crusher, we didn't bring the cement truck, we don't own the street, we own that corner. That's our
Right,
space
right.
where we build, where we fight, where we make love, where we flirt, where we do everything else. And so I think of Black Twitter as that stoop, as that corner,
Right.
as that porch, right? Where we can do the mundane discourses that sustain us through everyday life, right? In a space that kind of was built for that, but is still poorly misunderstood and how valuable that can be for us on an everyday basis.
Right. It's that notion of the stoop, the sort of metaphor of the stoop is interesting. It makes me think about the way in which our sort of material embodied presence on the stoop changes the stoop, right? It makes me think about how our embodied material way of wearing clothes will change fashion, right? But what's interesting in this space where you do your work about and that we're talking about is how there's a different kind of embodiment. It's an embodiment that is completely about our expression, our use of words, the kind of it's logocentric in a way, right? That then takes on this other kind of added element, it's like the stoop in that way. No, do you see this idea? I know you've been thinking about digital blackness. I mean, there's that famous article that was written for Teen Vogue, I think, a few years ago about the sort of use of particular kinds of memes and GIFs and other sorts of digital sort of ideas, I guess, or sort of to get these uses by the out group, quote unquote, by white people, right, to sort of perform a kind of digital blackness. Are you thinking about that still, or is that something that you sort of factor into your work you're doing now?
Yeah, I just gave a talk about this to the European US Popular Culture Association. And while I can understand why Black folk could be upset by the idea that white folk are using Black expressions to describe their internal state or their emotions, Toni Morrison wrote about that in 1998. She called it American Africanism, right? Where white people use Blackness to describe their innermost feelings, their longings, their hatreds, and the like. My problem with the digital blackface thing, and shout out to Lauren Jackson, because it's a really great concept for her to have brought up, right? Although I will say it's not hers. It was actually brought up, you'll find this interesting, by a young man who was writing about digital blackface in terms of how Black people were represented in games like Grand Theft Auto.
Oh,
because
really?
Grand Theft Auto became this violent simulator for white supremacist groups. Right. And so they would take on the persona of gangbangers in San Andreas, right, and go around shooting Black people as a way to get comfortable with the idea of exterminating Black folks. So that digital blackface. Also, you could think about it in terms of the ways that sports fans inhabit the Black bodies of their NBA or NFL superstars as they play 2K or Madden or anything else. So digital blackface has multiple variations. For me, the problem with talking about it for memes and GIFs. It's hard G, Scott, hard G.
Hard
G, graphics,
GIFs, okay.
It's
not
graphic
GIFs,
interchange
right.
format, not graphic.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate the correction.
No, that's me being pedantic because everybody will argue me down on that. It's fine.
No doubt.
So the media form that is being accused of being blackface, they're actually accusing the practice of using that media form, but to me, that seems to lead to an accusation that the media forms themselves are blackface, and I have a huge problem with that.
Hey, I've had the same feeling. Okay, say more, please, because that's sort of what I was thinking as well.
Right, and so I feel like because GIFs are moments extracted from a larger fictional or televisual narrative, right? Those are people acting as characters in that moment. And I would include Nene and Phaedra and all the rest of the reality show people. They are acting as. And while the reality shows might be considered cooning by people who are bourgeois, they are still real Black people who live in their Black ass lives in front of a camera. Right? So to accuse, what happens is you're actually accusing them of blackface, because they are unavailable to protest their usage by white people and expressing themselves. And that's where the problem lies for me, right? I could see some static memes, so they call them image macros in the technical term, where you have a picture with some words over it. Maybe that could be understood as digital blackface in some ways, but the actual televisual clips, many of which were extracted algorithmically, or many more were extracted purposefully by people who have access to YouTube, who were able to cut out that particular piece of the thing and then upload it because it felt good to them, right? Those are actual expressions of Blackness that we find incredibly valuable of and for ourselves, right? And so nobody's ever going to say a white man doing blackface is of value to Black people. Black people just don't do that, right? But the things where Nene is getting out the car and it looks like one of her foot is catty corner to the other foot, right? We all understand that moment, even if we've never worn high heel shoes, right? Or of Oprah making the concern face when she's listening to somebody, or Rihanna giving somebody a side eye. We have done those things. Those are moments of identification for us. The crazy part is there are moments of identification for white people too, because they're so enmeshed in the water that is Blackness that they're not necessarily reflexive about their relationship with Blackness.
Right. Right.
I'm willing to die on this hill. So, if people want to come at me,
no, it's real. It's funny. I just popped into my mind as you were talking. What's the Albert Murray quote? That American culture. What does he say? American culture is incontestably mulatto. Right, like mulatto being a word we don't use now, right?
Because now it's colorless.
But there's a way in which what he's sort of getting at, one of those some of the stuff you were talking about as well. This way in which where do we find the distinguish between the sort of color distinguish between some aspects of color, right? It's not a quote of his that I die by, but there are ways in which I can understand what he's getting at, particularly when we sort of think about commodification, when we think about the sort of material benefits of Blackness for people, right, across the racial line, across the racial divide, because that's the thing. Like it's the idea of sort of digitally mediated Blackness as a kind of identity space can potentially be fraught, right? It can be, particularly when we sort of think about what does Blackness mean, right? What is Blackness, right? And because it's always going to be inflected by geography and by class and by gender, right, and by sexuality, right? So ultimately, this idea of sort of networked online identity, I feel like is a interesting route towards thinking about the stuff there.
There's been an interesting corollary discussion with the Netflix movie Passing that just released, right? And there have been some really interesting discussions. Dr. McDowell, who's formerly at UVA, wrote the introduction to the
original,
the Penguin edition, right? Was talking about that
undergrad days, right?
But one of the things that's interesting to me, because of the way that colorism and light skin privilege has taken over recent internet dialogue, is this online discussion that Tessa Thompson could not pass for white.
Could not pass for white.
And I'm like, you don't know much about passing.
You don't know much. Thank you. No, that's the same thing I found myself tweeting. Isn't it funny how Twitter has that effect where there's all this kind of bold, forthright, with one's chest sort of proclamations of culture and the world, and then you read these tweets and you're thinking, do you actually know what passing means? Like, I get it, I hear where you're coming from, but it's sort of interesting how that operates on Twitter. It makes me laugh sometimes, but it also makes me sad sometimes, this sort of level of, but yeah, I saw a lot of those tweets too.
And so one of the things that does for me is it talks about how Twitter, because it's a medium that can be accessed and archived, does a lot to codify and calcify opinions that then don't get a lot of nuance, right? Unless you're like me, and I'll put a 6, 10, 15 tweet thread out to explain all of my position, but most people would drop them 280 characters and be gone, and then come back and like, well, why am I getting dragged? Why am I getting ratio?
Right.
And so Twitter doesn't naturally lend itself to discussions that require more nuance, like a discussion of passing, right? But it also has built in certain things in recent years where if you wanted to, you could build out a longer discussion, point by point, that people could respond to point by point. And I think in a way that helps us to evolve what it means to discuss being Black online, right? As opposed to blog spaces or even bulletin board threads, where the bulletin board threads were segregated off of the wider internet, and blog spaces really had a small audience, right? And so now you have a large audience that can come in at any time, at any point of the conversation, interject whatever they want to say, even if it's not relevant, right? But they still can participate in this conversation. And for me, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in the book, was that there's this informational blackness, right? Not quite metaphysical, right? Because it's still embodied in code and in content, but it's informational in that all of a sudden you can reference so many different things that are Black without having a Black body nearby, right, to reference them. It's almost like the Midwest, right? You can have sundown towns in the Midwest where they had no Black people, right? Right. But so you have all these resources for Blackness that are now available that really only have been available since maybe Tumblr Live Journal, so 09, 07, right? In ways that people can access them and interact with them and develop them and destroy them and constrain them. And we get frustrated because there are always people who are new to the conversations or who are just now getting reflexive, right? Who are like, well, yeah, I say X. I'm 21 and you old people don't know what you're talking about, right?
Are you reading my mind? Are you reading my mind, brother? Because I got to tell you, I mean, maybe this is the part of the conversation where the sort of get off my lawn part of the conversation. I don't know. I hate that phrase, but I'll deploy it anyway. But I am really curious, and I would love to hear thoughts from you about this, about that generational thing on Twitter, right? So there's the way in which we have the sort of people who are really, really invested in the generations, right? Millennials versus boomers versus X versus, fine, that's a discussion to have, I guess, right?
Right.
But I'm really curious about the, there's a kind of, conscious desire for some people to turn that into not just sort of joking discourse, but into to have real meaning, right? There's a and there seems to be, and maybe again, maybe this is my old man sensitivity, but there seems to be this kind of like willful imagining that pre-Twitter, pre-social media, pre-digital life, there just was no interactivity. There just was no development. I mean, are you laughing at me or with me? I don't know.
No, like, I'm agreeing with you, and it's really funny to think about it.
So you've noticed that? You've noticed?
Oh, absolutely. I think we discussed before this particular session. I'm trying to build out a talk on Twitter as memory work, right? And part of the memory work of Twitter is the fact that it reinforces this kind of endless present where the past only kind of glancingly exists. So most of the folk who are most active now on Twitter are between 18 and 30 years old, which means they came in on Twitter after it had already been 5 years old.
It had already been, right.
And had already been a certain thing. They didn't know blogs. They were 7, they were 12, right? They weren't looking at blogs. They weren't on Black Planet trying to make their page perfect with the right cursor and the perfect picture of you with the rose in the glass. They wasn't here for that, right? And so it is the habit of youth to say, you ain't up on this, you old, man. Why are you even trying to hang with the young folk, right? That's one of the things that youth do. But I argue for hip hop culture and for Blackness in particular, we are constantly fascinated by the new, and we want to gatekeep the new to make sure that we retain a certain type of energy, right? And so, you know, the idea of being old on Twitter automatically relegates you to Facebook groups and AOL. I'm like, AOL is before me, fam. Like, but they don't have any idea of that. You know, most of our students right now were born after 9/11. This is the world they know. And so that memory hole is real. It's reinforced by the fact that Twitter doesn't have a lot of capacity to invest in the past unless you're seeing receipts, somebody saying, hey, this you, right? This you doing that foolishness from back in the day, trying to claim something else, right? But for the most part, it's not historical, but neither is the larger web, right? If you could think of any website that's older than, say, 10 years, I can guarantee you they've changed the form of their homepage and their branding at least once. They've wiped entire archives, their old terms of service, the ways they used to do things. They've wiped all that stuff. They may have content up, but many more, you can't even access older content. Many of you journalists have found that when sites go down, all the stuff you have bylines on has gone. If you haven't saved it on your hard drive, it's gone. So the internet itself is a memory hole, right? What I find fascinating about Twitter, though, particularly with the pandemic and versus, right, is that we also did a lot during that time to recover Black history, Black culture, right?
Yes,
So
I would
the
agree with
Patti
that.
LaBelle, Gladys Knight
Right,
versus,
right.
right, the Teddy Riley Babyface versus. So we do a lot. We do a lot to also recover those things. So moments. There's one of the things I write about in the book called Thanksgiving for Black Families, right, which is about a Black Thanksgiving that is not solely centered on the idea that the Pilgrims came to break bread with the Indians while they're genociding them with smallpox, because we don't care none about that, right? For us, Thanksgiving is a moment of food and family celebration, right? Plus, you get to meet all the dysfunctional family members that you try to stay away from all year,
Right.
and a lot of that conversation revolves. And what people keep commenting on, which is fascinating to me, is like, I had no idea that all Black people knew what this was. Right. And so that's what I mean too when I talk about informational Blackness. Twitter serves as a kind of archive of all the things that we shared that we weren't aware that we shared. So like that one set of sheets with the diamonds that was maroon, all of us had those sheets.
Right.
That one set of plates with a certain pattern, we all had those plates, right?
Right.
And so finding out those things in common helps to kind of restore and maintain a Black cultural memory in ways that I find really useful. But again, you're right. That limitation of that is that it's still a kind of ever-present now, right? Or at best, of what I've been calling in the book, a post-present. So what can we do to survive the next 10 minutes, right? The next 2 days, right? That has come to the fore a lot more during the pandemic as well.
Right. No doubt.
I think I rambled. I'm sorry.
No. You ramble well. Don't even worry about it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So we're gonna have to open up for questions soon from people in the room who might have a question or two for you. If you have a question, I guess you should raise your hand, or we should figure out whatever the mechanism is for that. So we'd love to hear from people here in the room listening to this discussion. But can I ask you about how you in the book, you talk about something called Afro-optimism.
Oh boy.
And well, oh boy, because you can imagine, there are very many ways, and Afro-optimism can primarily be thought of in contradiction to or in conversation with, right, Afro-pessimism. Can you say a little bit about how you sort of formulate, how you think about this idea of Afro-optimism and how that's sort of informative of your work and in a sort of larger scheme about the Afro-future, Afro-pessimism, like just how do you sort of regard this idea of Afro-optimism?
Okay, so I talked earlier about how technologies could be understood as the practice, as the artifact, but also as how people understand themselves. And that third part could be understood as culture or belief. So every once in a while, I pretend I'm a social scientist and I needed to operationalize belief in a way that made sense to do a systematic inquiry of the beliefs that people ascribe to technology. And to do that, I settled on Francois Lyotard, and libidinal economy. Right. And libidinal economy is really hard to explain. So it is. One of the ways I found a way to explain it. One of the ways I began to understand it best was reading Wilderson, particularly Red, White, and Black. And Wilderson in his first chapter talks about how anti-Blackness can be understood as the libidinal economy of American arts and letters, which makes perfect sense. And he goes on to say libidinal economy is, and he's quoting Sexton, he says it's the pleasure, it's the likes, it's the hatred, it's the sexual, it's all of these feelings, emotions, but not just feelings and emotions. It's almost a visceral response to the world around you, right? So he says anti-Blackness is a visceral response of American modernity, which I completely agree with. Mm-hmm. And from there, a lot of people have built onto that, including Wilson, but also Moten, Sexton, and some others. And they're also citing Spillers and some other dope women scholars as well to say that you can only really understand the world. One of the best ways to understand the Black experience in the world is through Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism is the idea that Blackness is incommunicable to whiteness. There is no way that Blackness could be a part of the Western polity or a part of Western culture. To be Black is to not be human. I'm like, yo, I feel you on that. However, comma.
Not however, comma, right?
Because to me, it's a nihilistic viewpoint, right? It doesn't allow for any possibilities other than abjection, right? And so Moten in Blackness and Nothingness and a couple of other places, I have not read as much in the break as I should have, right? But in Blackness and Nothingness, he says that there's also a different way to understand anti-Blackness and social death, Orlando Patterson's social death.
Or
Right?
Patterson,
Says,
right? Mm-hmm.
Yep. And he says that Blackness is the celebration of thought, right? Blackness is actually the ability to dance in the graveyard of social death while proclaiming that we are going to turn this motherfucker out, right? Because Blackness is sociality for most. And I completely agree with that. That makes perfect sense to me,
Yeah,
right? And so you hit me with we're going back to the Baldwin essay that you taught today, the Black English is Language. And he has a quote that really summarizes well for me. What joins all languages and all men is the necessity to confront life in order, not inconceivably to outwit death, right? To confront life, not inconceivably to outwit death. And the price for this is the acceptance and achievement of one's temporal identity. That's an Afro-optimist paradigm. Right there, right? Because while we understand that racism is ever going and that the libidinal attitude which animates it, anti-Blackness, is never going, we are also simultaneously working to make it to the next day, what I call the post-president book, what Akil Mbembe calls fighting against the desiccation of modernity. I love that phrase, right? So he says modernity sucks the soul from us, right? And so what we do in our efforts to repair ourselves and to make sure we can get up for the next day and have a good breakfast, we continually take care of ourselves to fight against this capitalist modernist structure that we happen to be embedded within, because living is the important thing. To me, that's an Afro-optimist perspective as well, right? So Afro-optimism is basically Derek Bell's racial realism, if you want to get critical race theory, right? I will acknowledge that racism is an ongoing project from which I probably will not be able to escape from in my life, my children's life, my great-grandchildren's lives, but I will dedicate my resources to not only surviving it, but thriving in spite of it, right? And so that became really important to me because it's true. When Black people do stuff online, it often gets caught up by white people and they make money from it. So cornrows, Kardashians, fashion magazines saying, look at what the Kardashians invented, cornrows, or satin bonnets to sleep in, right? But apart from those moments of commodification, there's a whole wave of mundane expression that we do that is much more important and valuable to me than any moment of commodification. Because I argue, we bring our passions to life, and from those we can get commodified, but we don't have to.
We don't, right.
Right. And so that's to me the Afro-optimist perspective, that idea that you're doing because you can, because you want to, not because you know you're doomed, right? Or that this world will never change because of anything you do. That's just not helpful. It's
right. No, I agree. It's not. Yeah. No. Thank you for that. Should we are there questions from people in the room? Anyone have a question for us?
Make Janine answer.
Or for particularly for Andre. Janine, you have a question?
I just got here. I'm just snooping.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for rolling through. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me. I have to go teach at 5.
Okay, no doubt. Well, thanks for rolling through.
Whew, safe.
Oh, that's funny. I'm sorry, were you gonna say something? I'm sorry. Or did I hear a voice?
I feel like you have more than another question. Does somebody have a question they wanted to ask?
Yeah, I wanted to give room for someone to ask before I jumped in again. I don't know if someone had a question or not.
Their colleagues being shy.
So you and I have talked a little about you had this experience with this thing you saw on Twitter today, actually, right? This the Spotify thing.
Yeah.
Do you want to can you talk about that, what you saw today? Maybe other people sort of came across it as well and might be curious about this sort of moment that's happening.
So some wag, some jokester posted a Photoshop of how Spotify was basically responding to people who are looking towards a feature that they just debuted, which is the Spotify Unwrapped, which is a synthesis, a synopsis of all your listening over the year. And in bits and pieces, Spotify was using Black slang, right? To acknowledge how forward-thinking your taste was, how cool your taste was in music. And some smartass posted all of the possibilities for Black slang being corrupted kind of like white folk doing their version of African American vernacular in an entire image. And I can post it in the chat if people want to see it. It's really fascinating to me, right? And so it's fascinating to me because to me, there's something similar happening for Gen Z folk on TikTok who are now taking this language, right? The ways that they understand African vernacular language as simply plain English, right? And they're saying that's internet language. That's not Black vernacular.
Right.
That's our language, right?
That's
and I'm just
ours,
like,
right.
how? But again, it's that memory hole, right? If you've grown up and you've been obsessed with TikTok and YouTube for the last 5 or 6 years, right? Your taste has been catered to by the algorithm in ways that will reinforce a particular view of the world. So instead of seeing Black people do the Black dances, you'll see Charlie D'Amelio or Addison Rae doing the Black dances, right? Their capture of Black life. And that is the things that the TikTok video, the TikTok algorithm, or the YouTube algorithm brought you. So if you only see the capture, you'll never understand the originator. But never to be duplicated, always complicated, you know what I'm saying?
Right,
You'll never understand that piece. And similarly for corporations, there's been a long conversation about how many of the social media interns that are good at Twitter for corporations such as Wendy's or Popeyes are young Black women.
Wow.
Isn't
the word that the person who's sort of started, and maybe I'm getting my information wrong, but that the person at Spotify who had originally sort of was a Black woman intern, right?
It was a Black woman.
I thought I'd heard that. Yeah.
And so here you have another example of the vivaciousness of Black life being captured by corporations in order to sell product, which understandably breeds cynicism, right? And Black people are like, we can't have nothing, which is the thing that Black people have been saying forever, right?
Right.
But again, it's the Americanness of it all, right? And while it's a problem, I definitely think it's a problem. I often find myself in arguments with younger folk because they're like, well, we should get paid for that. I'm like, you're asking for a slippery slope. If you want to be paid for every utterance you make in social media, then what you're doing is taking words out of other people's mouths, right? You're like Pat Riley trying to copyright 3P. That's only something you and I remember, right? If you try to copy, LeBron trying to copyright trademark Taco Tuesday. Bam, Taco Tuesday is not yours. You didn't come up with Taco Tuesday. I don't care if you want to sell something related to it. You should not be able to capture that and restrict everybody else from using it simply because you want to make money from it, right? But this is an unavoidable fact. This is the desiccation of modernity and capitalism, right? They want to suck the life from things in order to sell it back to us in a reduced form, right? And I can see why people think it's problematic, but then I also then point them again towards the idea that without the vivaciousness afforded by Twitter and other spaces, we wouldn't have seen those things in the first place. Those things would have been locked in, right? They'd have been locked into the beauty salon, on the street, in the barber shop, where a lot of this stuff goes on, right? But it's a local phenomenon, right? It's a nationwide local phenomenon, but it's only available to that region.
Right.
We could even talk about the same thing for social protests, right? Will Smith, the famous internet sage and philosopher, once said, racism is not new. It's just that social media and smartphone cameras, shout out to Alyssa Richardson, right, with her book on witnessing. It's the smartphone camera that has showed us that racism happens everywhere. The cops are trash everywhere, right? Right. But and so people think, oh, this is happening more than it used to be. I'm like, ask your papa how much it happened in the 1960s. Ask us folk who were in New York in the 90s how often we got caught up on stop and frisk and broken against policing. Right? So it's not new, it's just televised. And if you want to go back to Gil Scott, right, the revolution will not be televised. Actually, Gil Scott, it's being recorded and uploaded, right, which is a very different thing because it places some of that in our hands. We don't have to wait for the cameras to show up. We are the cameras, right? And I think that's a valuable adjunct to what activism is and can be for what Twitter could be. Not the only thing it could be, but one of the things it's really good at.
Right. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. I mean, if to either open up for more questions or I appreciate you, Andre Brock.
I appreciate you, Scott Fosenbein.
And your work. It's important. I mean, so many of us spend so much time in these spaces, right? And sort of theorize it ourselves in so many different ways. But I am really sort of full of gratefulness and gratitude that you're doing the work you're doing.
Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you.
thinking about it in the way you're thinking about it. I'm looking forward to more work from you and bringing you to Michigan again when we're all, you know, back to normal, quote unquote. So
how we gonna talk about the desiccation of modernity and then you're gonna wish me more work? Like, what kind of friendship is this?
well, I don't mean it. I mean in a spiritual way, brother. I mean, you know, in that way. I'm talking about the work you and I will do on Zoom by ourselves. You know what I'm saying? That
Yes,
kind
sir.
of work.
Yes, sir.
So,
I'm signifying my bad.
I know you are. I know you are. But
Hey, this has been a pleasure for me, man. I really appreciate Michigan, DAAS in particular, for inviting me. This has been really fun, and hopefully we can do this again. I got to bring you my way so you can talk to my people.
Oh, no doubt. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. Thank you for this, everyone. Thank you for rolling through today.
Thank you, André. Thank you, Scott. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll talk to you again, brother.
We'll be in touch.
All right. Y'all take care. Have a good weekend.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No
Great
problem.
discussion.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Frida. That means a lot for me too, Frida, because I respect you quite a bit. Frida's
I love Frida.
No, but I love that that whole discussion on you know what is happening in social media. It's fascinating. You know, yeah, obviously it's wonderful. Well, thank you.
Frida's my mentor in the department, actually.
Oh, you lucky.
I am. I feel very lucky, no doubt.
He's lucky. He's lucky.
Y'all have a good holiday now.
Yeah,
Thanks for coming, everybody.